And welcome to another episode of Strange Planet. Looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be madly off in all directions, but primarily we're going to stay within the horror genre. But we'll also talk about something called the Montauk Project, and it inspired a documentary or a docudrama about this secretive and sinister project called Montauk Chronicles, which is the story of three men who claim that between 1971 and 1983, secret experiments were conducted deep beneath the surface of the Camp Hero Air Force Base in Montauk, Long Island. And as I say, we'll also talk about some iconic horror films with Christopher Garetano, who was born in New York. He's a graduate of the School of Visual Arts with a major in film. He is the creator and director of the award-winning docudrama, as I mentioned, Montauk Chronicles, which came out in 2015. Chris is also the co-creator, executive producer, and co-host of the History Channel's The Dark Files. In 2019, Chris created, directed, executive produced, and hosted his 8-episode investigative series, Strange World, for the Travel Discovery Channel networks. He's currently shooting several new TV programs. His first horror film, or first horror movie, writing his fictional novel, Montauk Boys, and is the creator and host of the Off to the Witch podcast. And a great pleasure to welcome Christopher Garetano to Strange Planet. Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, man.
And I should also mention that you join me every Friday on my weekday afternoon drive show, The Richard Serrett Show. You are the Sofa Cinephile, and we have a lot of fun, and I learn a lot from you as we discuss some of your favorite and some of our favorite movies.
It's a challenge because we have 10 minutes or less, right, to talk about these amazing movies, and I'm getting used to it though, and I love it. I love talking about this stuff with you. But I just saw like I could some of these subjects, some of these movies I could talk for hours about hours.
That's right. Well, you do it so well. Let's begin with the Montauk Project. For those not familiar with what this secretive, sinister experiment project was allegedly all about in Long Island back in the early 70s, leading into the 80s.
Sure. So I was first exposed to that concept and that idea. There was an independent book published by a man named Preston Nichols, and it was called The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. And I was aware of it. I believe I was in high school when it came out. And then I went to film school, and I didn't really think much of it because I visited Montauk when I was a child, and that was a resort town. That's where you went for your summer vacations, a week out of the year, maybe go, bodyboarding, surfing. There's some restaurants there. There was a movie house there. You go out on boats, go fishing. I mean, that's what the town is. But 5 miles from town, in many, many acres of woods, there is a semi-automatic ground environment radar tower peeking above the tree canopy, something I did not notice in the summertime because the foliage really kind of blocked it if you weren't looking in the right direction. Even when you went to the very edge of the ocean, Montauk Point, rocky beaches, away from town, you still didn't notice it. And in the early 2000s, I was interested in making a documentary about some kind of arcane subject. And one of them was I wanted to do something about the North American Sasquatch, something unlike what they're making today, which is 25 seasons of finding absolutely nothing. So, and I still have this idea in mind, and I'm going to do this, and it's very unique, but it would have cost a lot at that time. And a friend of mine said, listen, you live on Long Island, and I did at the time. Why don't you make something about the Montauk Project? And it's something I did dismiss years previous. And my idea, the reason why I went forward was because I loved stories told by these kind of isolated, reclusive old men who have a crazy story to tell. And that was the beginning of it. I wanted to go sit with Al Bielek, who was this elderly man in Fort Myers, Florida, or Preston Nichols, who wrote the book, up in his lab in upstate New York. And the prospect of doing that and beginning there and getting something very authentic from this conversation, from the conversation sitting with this old man in his backyard telling me this crazy tale, was where I started with it. And that's how it began for me. And then
Right.
other things happened.
And Al Bielek, I think I interviewed Al at least on one occasion, probably going back almost 20 years ago, and Preston Nichols, same thing. And Al Bielak claimed, it's a totally fantastical story, that he was involved with the Philadelphia experiment. There's some time travel involved, not only with the Philadelphia experiment, then afterwards. And there was reportedly uh, something called the Montauk chair that was part of the Montauk project, which allowed people to travel through time. And I think Stuart Swerdlow, you also interviewed Stuart in the film as well. Um, and then there was an element of well, there were children, kind of the abandoned or orphaned, homeless children swept off the streets in and around the town of Montauk, supposedly who were utilized in these experiments at this. Was it an abandoned Air Force base or was it still operational at that time?
So during the time they claim it was operational, there's some unique aspects to this too, because if you look at the basic plan of the story, it's cherry picked from science fiction, everything from Forbidden Planet to The Outer Limits to The Twilight Zone, Star Trek. I mean, V, the show V that came out in the 80s. There's elements of all of those in there. But the one element that juxtaposed with the rest of them, to me, doesn't make sense if you're selling the science fiction story, is the kids being kidnapped, brutalized, murdered in some respects, drugged. It's just so out of place. And that was another curious aspect of it. They said it happened between 1971 and 1983. The base was still in operation, but what was suggested was that this kind of lax operation, compartmentalized operation where these gentlemen may have been just hanging out, essentially, any military personnel, just maintaining, caretaking. It was beneath the ground, unbeknownst to them, in a facility unknown to anybody that didn't have major clearance. That's where all this other stuff was happening. And there's some contradictions too, because, in one instance, you have Al Bielak and Preston Nichols claiming they took a train underneath the ground from Brookhaven Labs, which was much further west than Montauk, mid-island or a little further, to Montauk under the ground. And then they would go home the same way. But there's a moment where when they meant to save the day, they had a meeting in a local motel, the Memory Motel, where allegedly the Rolling Stones wrote the song about. They had this memory to take down the project by using abilities that Duncan Cameron had. This was another one of the gentlemen. And they would release, through the usage of the Montauk chair, and this is reversed engineered alien technology, they would release the monster from the id from Forbidden Planet, which in the Montauk story, is Junior, this kind of energy beast that takes the form of a giant Sasquatch or just this kind of invisible force. And that's what it was described as. And it was a lot to take in. I mean, I loved hearing the stories from Al and Preston, and there's just so many unique qualities about them. It didn't strike me as a beneficial for them to lie, because neither of them were really making any money at all off of this situation.
It's an incredibly complicated story, and as I recall with Al Bielak, and I've also interviewed Duncan Cameron. I mean, it's difficult to keep them on a single narrative. They are very difficult to follow at times. I mean, you can get lost.
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a lot of time to think about this. Is it possible that they were afraid to talk about certain information in the 90s? And I believe that's when you were interviewing them, correct?
Or early 2000s.
Right. Early 2000s is when they started to reveal a little bit more. In that book, it seemed more geared towards this kind of science fiction adventure tale, removing a lot of the brutality that came later in conversation. And they were like, well, let's shape it around this. And they loved science fiction. Were they afraid to reveal certain things? Because still, like, why on earth would you put that element in there? It just seems so strange and random to put in a science fiction adventure story, and perverse and disgusting, and all these elements that just don't go along with the other stuff. it's just so strange, no?
Indeed, it is. Um, there's also the question of whether parts of, I think they've alluded to this, that parts of their memories were altered and so forth. It's incredibly convoluted. But you tell the story so well in the Montauk Chronicles. Where can we still see that?
So now, for years I was keeping it really close to the vest. I It was only available through ordering it on my website, DVD or Blu-ray, or downloading it from my website. But now I signed something recently, I think, that really worked well in terms of distribution, and it is available on Tubi, Plex, Apple TV, Amazon. It's not free on Prime, but you can watch it for free on Tubi and Plex and Roku. So it's on my YouTube channel as well. With my introduction, it's not included in some of these other streaming networks.
And what's the status of? I know you were working on the fictional novel Montauk Boys, which I guess based on the children of Montauk that were swept off the streets, disappeared. What's happening with that?
So that actually began as I wrote a pilot episode for a television series, and I was speaking with an MTV, the former president of the MTV was meeting with him and his company in New York, and they loved it. They loved the pitch. You can actually see my original pitch video that I showed them is on my YouTube channel. I wanted to put it out there because there's a lot of thieves in this industry, and the script was going around because it was optioned by that company for over a year. And essentially, it takes place after the alleged Montauk project being shut down in 83. This is around 86. And it's a gang of the worst kids you could observe in high school. Some of them have been expelled. Switchblades, motorcycles, whoever can get their hands on it. They're in tons of trouble. But this government program sees them as assets. And the Jack Pruitt character, who I portrayed in Montauk Chronicles and who was talked about by Preston Nichols and Al Bielek, is carried over into this as the program director. So this Montauk project is now revived in 86 underneath the ground. And this kind of fictional configuration of Montauk and the town I grew up in, Northport, I call it Northcliffe in the novel, is now the targets of interest are these bad kids. Now, I got that from actually talking to some of the so-called former Montauk boys, which made more sense to me. Like a gentleman named, and it's a fake name, James Bruce. He claimed he was one of these bad kids, and he said they were specifically looking for kids like us who no one would believe if we got out of this situation somehow. And also, they liked the idea that we would burglarize homes. They liked the idea that we had this idea for crime, this propensity for crime. So these kids are being targeted for this program to be turned into government assassins, and they're being picked
Soldiers.
off one by one. Yes. So that's essentially the tale from their perspective. Some of them are a little older, some of them are in high school age, and it would be like as a shorthand, it would be, more like The Outsiders, or a very sharp and edgy version, something, the antithesis of, no offense to Stranger Things. I think it's a good show, but it would be very, very different than that.
Right. It's funny you mentioned The Outsiders. You and I talked about The Outsiders, Francis Ford Coppola's underrated film, recently on my afternoon program. And as you said that, I was thinking, yeah, it sounds like a combination of The Outsiders and maybe, I don't know, The Bourne Identity.
Sure. Yeah, because that's what some of these kids are being turned into. And I just, I love the characters. I love the ideas. And this is no offense to the collaborators that were really interested in my work. I just felt like at that time, at least, in the boardroom talking about it, some of the characters and scenarios were already being diluted. And I didn't want that. So I figured, okay, and here's another scenario in the business of as you know, you can have a screenplay that means the world to you. By the end of the situation, it could be rewritten 7 times over, and a lot of other names are attached, so your vision is also removed. And I just felt writing this novel is something I needed to do, get that story out there the way it was intended and the way I intended it to be. And so that's what I'm doing. And also, one of the collaborators at that company even said, that's a great idea. You should, because now you'll have more of a a strength if you were to translate it with us or someone like us,
Right. The Montauk Boys. Look
Yeah.
for it soon, hopefully, at a bookstore near you.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.